Welcome all to our live panel conversation. We'll give it just a couple of minutes for people to file in. And as you're doing that, it'd be really interesting to see where everyone is dialing in from. We've got well over 100 registrations for the event from a whole heap of different industries. There's about 12 different countries and a whole heap of different roles. So as you're joining us, it'd be great just into chat, just to put in there where you're joining us from. So to kick us off, Auckland, New Zealand, our friends just from across the ditch, welcome. Welcome, Ben. Wurundjeri Land, Melbourne, welcome, Maria. Good to have you. Now, I'll be introducing Julia, Stefan and Graham shortly, but just briefly, Julia and Stefan are joining us from Europe, and Graham is based in Sydney, and I'm in Melbourne. Welcome, Helen from Hong Kong, Teresa, Austria, Marcel from Sydney, just down the road from you, Graham. Dimitri from Amsterdam. Welcome, Dimitri. Good to have you joining us early-ish in the morning for you. Ian from Eastern Melbourne, welcome as a local. Mary Jane, Wurundjeri Land, Melbourne. Great to have you with us, Mary Jane. Yeah, as I said, there's about I think there's about 12 different countries. So I think that's what we're seeing with the topic, that it's a real discipline that is really growing momentum. And there's real kind of pockets of the discipline popping up all over the place. And it'll be interesting to hear from Stefan and Julia in terms of what they're seeing in their part of the world as well.
That Doncaster, the UK, I guess.
There we go, Nick. I think it's Doncaster, Melbourne. It could be, or it could be UK. Simon from the beautiful Mornington Peninsula. Welcome, Simon. Just down the road. Josh from Melbourne. So we've got a few locals. Very good. Well, let's kick it off. People can join us as we go. So welcome to our live webinar this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. We've just had a quick hello from Julia, Stefan and Graham, but I'll formally introduce them shortly. I'm Andrew Bird. You're stuck with me as your host today from Foundstone Advisory. And just for a brief bit of context, Foundstone we're a pure strategy advisory based in Melbourne, Australia. And we use open strategy principles with all our clients who are various mid-sized organizations right up through to enterprise clients in Australia and internationally. And myself personally, I've seen firsthand outcomes of organizations who have started to open up the strategy process and how powerful it is from a market insights perspective, new revenue generation, staff buy-in and execution. We're one of the champions of the approach in Australia, and I'd like to think perhaps one of the leaders in Australia. And we see it gaining real significant momentum. You'll hear from Julia and Stefan from their part of the world. The momentum, I think, is a lot greater than here now at the moment. But we see it in the context of the topic today, really relevant for the markets we're in. I'm sure we'd acknowledge there's a degree of uncertainty out there. So we put this topic together to address those key areas. So just a brief bit of housekeeping and agenda before we dive in. I'll be introducing the panel very shortly, giving you a bit of background of where they come from and their experience. I'll then just give a brief bit of context of, again, why the topic in a bit more detail. And then we'll open it up to the panel conversation. So it'll be a free-flowing conversation. We haven't got slides. Most of our attendees say they want the conversation, as they're a bit sick of the formal slides, and it will be interactive. We're really looking forward to hopefully getting a number of questions from you, the audience, and we'll be answering those as we go through. We're not going to necessarily leave it to the end, so we'd love to get your questions as we go through. We'll be keeping note of those. There's some key resources at the end of the preso that we'll be going through, and how you can contact Foundstone, and then all of the panelists. So without further ado, let's introduce the panel. And I'll start with you, Julia. Welcome, great to have you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Andrew, for setting this up and for the invitation.
Not at all. So Julia, a bit of background. Julia is the Professor of Strategic Management at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. And previously, she was a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford in the UK. Julia is one of the leading global voices, educators, and scholars on the topic of open strategy. Her work has been published across Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan, and of course is the co-author of Open Strategy. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
Next, we have Stefan. Welcome. Great to have you with us, Stefan.
Yes, good to be here. Good morning. Hello to everybody.
So Stefan is the CEO of IMP, Innovative Management Partner, who are one of the first global consultancies to bring open strategy into the mainstream. Through Stefan's leadership, IMP started using open strategy over a decade ago. So we're going to be hearing some really interesting stories and evolution of it over those 10 plus years. IMP have helped hundreds of clients, right from large enterprises down to smaller family and community organizations, in developing breakthrough strategies through the approach. Stefan's also, of course, the co-author of Open Strategy, and he lives between Zurich, Switzerland, and Rio in Brazil, if I've got that right, Stefan.
That's true. That's true. That's to combine the best things of both worlds. Yeah, that's good.
It sounds like it. It'll be great to hear the insights from those different regions. And last but not least, Graham Kenny, more of a local from Sydney. Welcome, Graham.
Oh, thanks, Andrew.
So Graham is Australia's #1 strategy author and speaker. He's a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review. You would have seen many of his articles, strategy articles, and broader. And he's also authored 5 books. Graham draws from a career spanning academia. He's been a direct CEO of a number of roles, consulting and strategy education. Foundstone have worked directly with Graham on various client strategy consulting engagements, both in Australia and internationally. Graham's in Sydney, as I mentioned, and he's always reminding me how much better Sydney is than Melbourne, I believe. So good, healthy rivalry. So before we go into the panel, just wanted to briefly touch on a bit more context about why we've chosen today's topic and why we think it's so important. We're going to be using the terms participative and open strategy, those terms, relatively interchangeably today. There might be some slight nuances that actually come out of the panel conversation, which will be really interesting as well. So those three main aspects. The first one, we see there's a lot of research that is spelling out that literally 2/3 of traditional strategic plans are failing. Pretty damning stats. And in times of uncertainty, the pace of change, the technology advancements, this really just gets amplified. And you might have seen the spiel we put in the event blurb, that from all our perspectives, trying to flesh out a strategy with just a small group of executives based on their assumptions can really now actually have quite a negative impact. And it's actually more noticeable, of course, in an uncertain market. And the second one is, it's really critical for the modern leader. Now we're looking at this, I'm looking at this from both a leadership and a career development, and also from an organizational leadership perspective. We see that these approaches to strategy are no longer really just a nice to have skill set. They're really critical for keeping relevant as an executive and as a manager, but also in where the world is heading. Staff, clients, society, as we all know, are demanding more transparency, which is brilliant. And it actually removes pressures from leaders to think that they need to have all the answers. So in my personal journey, it's been brilliant in terms of acknowledging that no one has all the answers, and we need to open it up. And lastly, just to acknowledge, just to be really clear, because I get asked this question a lot, and I'm sure the panel sometimes do as well, in the terms they use, that these terms can be either perhaps perceived as a bit warm and fuzzy, or then on the other end of the scale, they could be quite scary. When we talk about opening up strategy, some people can think, well, what's happening there? What am I losing control? So just want to be really clear, and we'll cover it more, of course, is that leadership still retain 100% of the overall decision-making. The open approach doesn't open it up to some kind of out-of-control voting process, and we'll be covering a bit more context on that. So we see open strategies being really valuable in upfront market customer insights, in particular as a strategy advisory, but we'll be covering more context today. So just to end with just a brief bit of research here, you might have seen this slide before. This came out of the open strategy research. The 200 executives were asked some of the outcomes of what they saw directly in their organizations when deploying open strategy. And as you can see, there's a direct link to revenue generation and profits. So I'd like to acknowledge that. So let's move on. Enough from me. Let's move on to the panel conversation. Julia, I might start with you, just with a really, really simple one in essence, but not really simple. Let's start from right from the fundamentals. In your view, what is open strategy? And perhaps what is an open strategy?
Thank you, Andrew. I get the easy questions, which are easy to answer in 3 minutes. No, let me maybe start from two perspectives, because as a professor, I always have to bring in the academic and scientific view. So there is the view that has been developed in academic research on open strategy that essentially builds the concept on 2 dimensions, and those dimensions are increasing transparency, but also increasing participation from individuals outside of the top management team. Quite simple. So providing more information to external and internal audiences, but also gathering more information from those audiences. And in our work, we have mostly focused on this participation dimension. So really including ideas, perspectives, suggestions from a really wide range of individuals, from different fields, from different backgrounds. Could be suppliers, customers, could be experts, people from universities, so a very employees. So those are the most obvious ones, the closest ones, employees from different functions and backgrounds. So in a very small nutshell, openness in the strategy process is really broadening the view beyond, I would say, the traditional people that are conventionally involved, which are typically just top management team, maybe one or two outsiders and consultants. But here it's really about broadening the perspective. So I would say that's what openness is in the strategy process.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for your very clear answer. The mix of transparency and increasing participation, I think you mentioned in particular gathering information, is really relevant. Can we touch just briefly on perhaps what isn't open strategy in a nutshell? Mm-hmm. I know it's not easy to do, is it, sometimes, but...
So, I mean, the positive thing is if you're talking with people about more transparency and more participation, typically everybody agrees that that's valuable. You don't get an answer like, we don't need that, or I don't think that works. But if people start thinking about including a large number of people in the strategy process, suddenly they get a little bit scared. You mentioned it in your introduction. So they feel quite intimidated. They feel like, okay, if I'm not going to have all the answers, am I losing control over the answers? Am I losing control over the process? And suddenly people become a little bit hesitant. So it's very important, as you pointed it out already, that openness does not mean chaos. It does not mean losing control. Openness needs to be managed very carefully. It needs to be set up in a very systematic manner. So you need to be clear as an organization. Why are you opening up? How could you open up? And the very good news is open strategy is not only one specific approach or tool. As we have discussed it before, it's a very broad range of approaches and tools that you could use as an organization. The only tricky thing is finding the best approach for your specific situation. And I think that is something that that managers and leaders need to become aware of, that they are not giving up control, but by carefully setting up the process, they can choose the best approach for them, keep control, and still benefit from openness.
Brilliant, thank you. I think it's really nice to hear that inverse of what is and what isn't. So thank you, Julia. Now, Stefan, I mentioned, and I'm still learning in terms of the kind of the depth and breadth you've had with Open Strategy over a decade. Can you take us through a bit of perhaps the high level evolution of what you've seen as you run a significant consultancy using these principles? Can you talk us through a bit of the evolution from kind of 10 or so years?
I can try, Andrew. When I look back, so it was about a decade ago when we decided, hey, we have to open up our strategy work. Yeah, we start very poor, so we have the strategic intent to do so, but on the level of tools, there's really nothing. So we have the old tools, and we try to apply the old tools to the new world. And yes, this was not very successful. And this is my first point I would like to focus on, Andrew. Yeah, if I look back about 10 years here, we have now a very specific, I call it suite of tools, which are fully dedicated to this open approach. This is a big step. So, for example, when you're in an early stage of the strategy process, you have to analyze maybe your competencies or the trends and drivers. These are total different tools, yeah, compared with the stage of the strategy process when you start to evaluate or some options, or if you would like to have the exploration of totally new ways how you can move on with the company. So my first thing I would like to share with the audience is, now we have a different set of tools, and you have not only to use the IMP tools, no, everybody is invited, yeah, to form his own tools. And this is a very strong message, yeah, as Julia puts it. Open strategy is not a complete set of things you have to do like this. No, you can innovate innovation management. You can strategize your strategy by using this open approach. Yes, by being an inventor of the strategy challenge in your company. So you can have some orientation how we can do it, but then I think every company, yeah, is invited, yeah, yes, to do their own things in strategy. This is also for me a very important point. But if you have a look on this suite of tools, yeah, there are very specific things now. It's totally a different format, yeah, by exploring something compared to evaluation or even the implementation, because we have this strategy, this open approach, not only by doing the work on the front end. No, we covered the complete cycle, yeah, from the very early stage, yeah, thinking about the future, having maybe a shared understanding about dynamics out there, yeah, up to implementation and scaling up a business. There is a huge difference, Andrew, from now compared when we start again 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
I see. And just a bit further in terms of, because there was a question at registration, someone asked, in terms of comparing it to that traditional top-down, is there any, in terms of the evolution, have you seen that speed up in certain areas or more recently due to certain aspects?
Yeah, maybe I can touch this question with two different answers. So the first thing is, the audience today is totally different one when we started. Our first project, and this was surprisingly for me, yeah, we start with the huge companies, with the big tankers, yeah, but with very, yes, I call it little topics, if you know what I mean. So they throw something about, yeah, in our pitch, yeah, say, hey, maybe you can help us in these specific questions. We try it often, we do not succeed. Maybe open strategy could be, yes, a key to unlock the door. This is when we start with the audience. Big tankers, but I think now questions, minor questions, not the real impactful. Then, obviously, we moved down to the small and medium-sized companies, and then we start really to work on the strategic DNA of the company. Yeah, this is what open strategy is all about. Yeah, as Julia puts it, it should be, yes, a process where lots of guys, lots of externals, interns were involved, and then we are working with the small and medium-sized companies, yes, on their strategic core. What might be the next step? How can we position in the future? Can we, yes, switch from this positioning to quite a different one in the future? What is the impact on our offering? What is the impact on our value chain? And then, in the last 12, 15 months, yeah, the huge family-owned companies open up the doors. And this was very interesting for us because now we are not on the minor issues at the big tankers. Now we are back, huge organizations, but now we are moving step to step to the strategic heart, to the core aspects of corporate strategy. And I think there, it's very important to open up the process because we should not rely only on the assumptions, on the hypothesis of one guy at the top, maybe the CEO, the owner. There we need this, what we call this variety of perspectives to have a better quality and strategy. This is what I have seen, the elaboration of the tools and also in the audience.
Brilliant, thank you. I like the way you describe the big tankers, those big organizations at the start. Small to medium, and then family-owned. As I understand, there's a lot of big family-owned organizations in Europe, of course. So it's really interesting to hear that life cycle. So thank you, Graham. If we could kind of switch a bit in terms of your experience in relation to this. You've adopted and advocated for participative management for a long time through articles and a lot of your education. Can you give us a bit of context of why?
Yeah, Andrew. Thinking back now to the literature on participative management, it probably had its heyday in the late 70s. So we're looking at something now that's in that sense of 40 years back. My interest when I first became an academic was in participative management, which came with another title, interestingly. Industrial democracy was another term that was used. And the idea was to bring more people into the decision-making process. The word democracy obviously gives that away. And for two reasons I was interested. I think on equity grounds was one. It's just part of my makeup to try and pull more people into a decision-making process, to share ideas and so on. So I think it was really equity. And I used to visit these organizations, manufacturing organizations particularly, and you'd find people on the shop floor that had a lot of good ideas, but they weren't brought into the decision-making process, and someone up in the office would decide what happened on the shop floor. And often they weren't the right decisions because people weren't consulted, and that seemed to me to be very weird. But it was part of that sort of almost class structure of the us and them, which was around at the time, and even in Australia, which is quite an egalitarian society, there was still the workers and the management. And that breaking down of those barriers was important to me, and I certainly was one to emphasize that. So that's equity. But the other part of that was the quality of the decisions. Bad decisions were made because management didn't consult with the workers. And the workers had the answers, but they're never allowed to express them to senior management. So, but that phase was in operations. Now, operations is not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is the business strategy. Where's the organization going? Not how to make the organization more efficient, but what is the direction the organization should go in? And I think that's a big shift. So that's how I got interested originally, and that's why I remain interested, and why I see it's very important to where the future of organizations is going.
Brilliant. And just on there, we've received a question on that kind of theme from Simon Phillips. So thank you, Simon. And I'll come to your question, Marcel, very shortly. Simon's asking us, does Australia have a culture style of management that makes an open strategy approach different to an implementation in Europe or the US? Just briefly, Graham.
Well, to me, having worked in the US, UK, visited European countries, I would say Western countries like Canada, the US, Australia, UK, Austria, Germany would have a similar way of doing it. Mm-hmm. Where the differences come, I think, when you get into Asian countries, for example, Japan has a different style. And of course, that's been written about a lot, Japanese management. But if you take, for example, some other Southeast Asian countries, I think there's a question about losing face and not being seen to know all the answers. So I think that's that may evolve, but I think there are cultural differences.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Graham. Really interesting to hear that context right from the industrial democracy terms and the shop floor. Thank you. Julia, I'm going to come to you, and there's also a question here from Marcel. Thank you, Marcel. So I might blend that with a question. So Marcel's asking, is open strategy close to the approach of involving stakeholders? And so let's just maybe tackle that one in line with the topic of today, with managing uncertainty. Could you have a go at that?
Yes, sure. I think, yes, it's very closely linked to the concept of involving stakeholders, although I would argue that open strategy even goes beyond, systematically goes beyond levels and degrees of inclusion and participation through those tools that have been developed that Stefan mentioned. So I would say yes, but just the degree of inclusion is bigger in terms of why it's so helpful to include those people, those different stakeholders from different domains in the strategy process. At this point of time where we are facing all those uncertainties, volatility, there are, I think, two big issues involved. The first one is, if we think of all those rapid developments, this uncertainty, those big complex challenges that we are facing, even at the societal level, it's just clear that a small group of people that have the same background, the same education, same experience within a specific industry might not be able to let's say, see how it will develop in the future and get all the trends and the developments. And that has nothing to do with their abilities, but that's just the way how our brain works and how our cognitive minds are set up. So on the first hand, it helps to get those fresh and new perspectives that we need in such a situation. And secondly, in such situations, we just need the commitment and engagement of a large group of people that are willing to really realize and enact those changes that are necessary. Because the best strategy doesn't help if we just have it in a document or we put it in the drawer. We need the people to enact it and to really, through their activities, decisions, their behavior, day to day, really enact this strategy. And in order to get this commitment, and that's a big challenge, as we have seen, it's just good to involve people and have them along the side and really give them a feeling of ownership along the process, because there's a lot of research on how this sense of ownership really actively translate into actions, into becoming active. And I think that's, especially in situations that we are facing today, more important than ever. And that's the interesting tension, especially in such situations, even crisis situations, we tend to stick to what we know and to gather together in small groups and just decide very quickly. And especially in such situations, this openness could be so beneficial. But I think it takes some courage to do it, especially in such difficult situations.
Andrew, can I add something there?
Go for it, Graham.
In the article, which I'm sure you're going to refer to, or that Harvard Business Review article you're going to ask me about, leaders need to get comfortable collaborating on strategy. What is interesting about that is went straight to the most popular list. And I was looking at it just before we came on air here, and I thought, what was it about that? There is a tool in there which came from a regional council, and the person's name is Megan in the article. And I thought it was a very good tool that she used. She had stakeholders down the left-hand side, and across the top, she had the methods of engagement. And the methods of engagement included online engagement, summits, forums, special meetings, and surveys, to just mention a few. And the reason I raise that is I think some of these things are best for some stakeholders and not so good for others. For example, you probably, if you're running a regional council, you can think of this table, you'd think, well, we need some citizen forums. Okay. So then online engagement, we could use that for a different group of people. And that might be something that the listeners could or viewers could take away from this, that idea of having a table, listing your stakeholders and looking what techniques of participation do you use, and then just basically mark the squares in the table and then run with that.
Like it. Thank you. Thank you. I think, yeah, we'll be sending out some of those articles afterwards that people can have a good read through. Stephanie, if I can come to yourself, and in terms of talking through some current real life examples, you've given us, some context of right from those big organizations right through to smaller. There's a question here from Dimitri, how open strategy approach can be implemented during different startup stages. So I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but in terms of some examples, would you be able to perhaps talk through one or two, one perhaps in the context of the startup stage, and then perhaps a different size?
I try to do. So I have also written the question of Dimitri. Yes, so one example was a startup company based in Germany. They are in the roof tile business. So they will bring an innovation to the market. It's a solar roof tile, and they would like to, yes, disrupt the solar panel market. Yeah, this was in 2015. They are competing against Elon Musk because this guy also had the strategic intent to tap into this market. They have a strategy, they have a common understanding, and the guy, the founder, today he's still in the team, he's serving as the CTO of the company. The guy, he knows everything about roofs and roof tiles, and he could tell stories around the clock. So we get in touch with him. And yes, it was a brilliant product. And yes, the CTO was brilliant. The technique was brilliant. But the figures, they are very disappointing. So this was the starting point. And then we used this open strategy approach for this startup. And I will share with you what we did. So my fear was that this guy knows too much about solar roof tiles, if you know what I mean, because he was totally blocked by all the things he is knowing about. So he has what I called core beliefs in his startup management team. There are 5 guys, and they have then the same shared understanding. This is the Bible of roof tiles. Yeah, these are the core beliefs. The business has to work like this because we are the masterminds of this business. And then we say, okay, give me only 1.5 days, and I would like to reflect this. So we call this the kill the concept. This is one of the open strategy possibilities. Yeah, you can tap in with not investing too much time. So we invited then, yes, a huge audience, not only stakeholders and additional thing, but we need some energy companies. We need some guys who are planning houses. We have the solateurs. Yeah, we have all these guys, even the craftsmen, yeah, who are working on the roof. And it was very surprisingly only 1.5 days in a well-structured manner. Yeah, we get a lot of impact. And after this, go back to Cornelius, who is the founder, say, hey guys, look at this. How can we handle this? Because there are some points, yeah, they are quite the opposite what they have their core beliefs on. And this was a very strong process. This was not an early stage in the startup. They have already started and founded, but the business model is not scaling. Nowadays, we shifted totally the strategy after this, I call it open strategy shock for them. Yeah, we are then not deciding selling roof tiles. It makes no sense to go with these roof tiles in a B2C business. Yeah, we go back. Nowadays, we are not selling roof tiles. So the roof tiles are selling by the producers of the roof tiles and not by these companies. So we totally rebuild and reshape the business model. But this is a very good example for a startup, yeah, to have maybe a second or a third view what they have in their founding intention, yeah, then to really start up with the startup. This is a good example. It's not a heavily time investment, only 1.5 days, well prepared. And after this, either you have another proof of the pudding, yeah, with the externals, or you have lots of questions, yeah, to talk about, and maybe then, yeah, to impact the strategy after having heard this external audience.
That's fascinating. I love how you painted the picture there in terms of the founder knew too much, core beliefs, and we can all relate to that. We can all relate to that with good intent, can't we? Because we're so pure. And I suppose it's even more prevalent in the startup world because there's such a belief in the belief system. But I suppose just looking at a broader example, those knowing too much can certainly be applied to those big tanker kind of big organizations as well in your experience.
Yes, we worked for a huge chemistry giant. Yeah, all of you know the name. It's spread all over the world, and they're thinking about the future. And if they are thinking about the future of polymers, yeah, you have to think about 10, 15, 20 years ahead. Yeah, and they have lots of resources in what we call the foresighting. So they have huge teams, well-educated teams to do the foresighting, but they were not sure if they have made the right, yes, I call it, yes, patterns, yeah, about the future. And then, for example, I will give you an example. If the cars are not used by the owners like it is today, yeah, and the cars, yeah, have to be cleaned often differently, and if you have to clean cars often differently, this might impact the interior of the cars, and then you are back on the world of polymers. And so we built with this company in the performance materials business, yeah, long, I call it chains of learning, yeah, with external experts. We have about 250 external experts from the different regions, from Northern and Latin America, from the Asia Pacific area, and from Central Europe, to only, yeah, find and formulate some hypotheses about the future, what they then can use, yeah, to check their R&D portfolio landscape if they are working on the right topics in the right way. So this is an example for a huge company, a big tanker, yeah, for a huge process. Such a process, it takes about 12 up to 14 months, and you have to involve lots of external experts in these different areas. But it was very, very, very helpful for the company to have this outside-in view, because at the end, we have seen that some of the R&D projects are senseless, and we have to, yes, reshape the corporate R&D portfolio based on the initiatives, yeah, they are working on. This is an example for a huge multi-billion company, which is also applying the open approach in the very early stage of the process.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear those similar principles in whatever situation, from a startup to a big multinational. So thank you. Graham, I'm going to come to you. And in terms of, where and how have you used participation in your own strategy consulting? And there's a question here from Kissa. Open strategy is one of the best strategies ever, as it enhances employee engagement. So I'm wondering if you could also touch on perhaps the employee engagement side in terms of what you've seen.
Yeah, I also want to go beyond employees, because I think we have talked a lot about employees here, but I think there's another other groups that should come into this discussion. But just on employees, I've run probably the largest group would have been for a major law firm in Sydney, 34 staff, including all the partners and the senior managers, and they came from all over Australia. And over the course of 2 days, we went through a process, broke out the groups, brought ideas back to the main group, and so on. It was just fantastic. The ownership was great. The insights were terrific. And so what you do with those processes is you achieve a few things. One is you get some really great ideas. The other thing is you get ownership, and the ownership of the process, but also the ownership of the outcomes. And the ownership of outcomes is very important when it comes to execution, because when you want to execute, you've got 34 people that are basically on board because they're a part of that process. Now, if I could just go to another aspect here, which is about bringing the outside in. This is where you bring customers, suppliers, and so on into the process. And what I advocate here is having them sit, let's suppose it's a 2-day session, sit with the senior management team, or the 30, let's say the group of 34 in this case, for a period, or not so much sit, I should say present to, over a 20-minute period, what are you looking for from the modern law firm? Let's just stick with that example. Why are you dealing with a different law firm? Or why do you deal with us rather than the alternative law firm? If you get that conversation going, 34 people in that room will hear for the first time what it's like to be a client, because they're not a client. And the other thing I'd mention here is the other thing you would look for is the word story, S-T-O-R-Y. I'm very keen on story. And the first time I heard about this actually was from German consultants in Academy of Management conference, and they were talking about this. So there you go, full circle here. And the importance of a story is you can see from beginning to end how that client uses your product or service. And I followed up on the idea of story and why story works. And of course, now there's lots of people writing about the powerfulness of a story. If you want to engage your audience, tell a story. Don't hit them with stats. But the interesting thing for strategies, once you hear that story, you do get that aha moment. That aha, I didn't realize they were doing that with that product. I had no idea they really wanted that from a retail store. I had no idea that they're looking for ongoing service and they're prepared to pay X amount of dollars for it. So I think this is where we're going as well, on openness, on participation, not just employees, but suppliers, customers, clients, community, but make sure that you let them do the talking. You can structure the process, but always look for that story that's going to give you that insight.
Brilliant, thank you. And Maynard, I saw your question there. I'll come to it in a minute. I might get Stefan to answer it in a second, just in terms of the timing around that when you're opening it up. But Julia, I'll just come to you in terms of, as a professor at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and I know you travel a lot in Europe, UK and broader. Can you give us a bit of view of how this is being taught? I think Australia perhaps is a bit behind the times, it's not unusual, but can you give us a bit of a picture of how this is being taught and used in that context?
Yes, I think that's very important, because education is how we reach the future leaders and managers and people within organization. So we can't teach the old tools that have been developed in the 70s, in the 80s, when we were facing a completely different world. We have to teach tools that are really adapted to those new realities that we talked about. So we see increasingly across the schools that those concepts, also open strategy, but of course, different kind of concepts that closely relate are taught in strategy courses. To foster this and in order to encourage this, we have prepared a full set of teaching material that is really open, available to everybody there who is interested in spreading the word about this. But we see that it's increasingly used and increasingly taught and spread all across the different business schools. But of course, it's a slow process. It takes time, but we see some movement here.
And in terms of it seems the kind of the literature I see coming out of Europe, it seems like that Europe are kind of leading the way in this sense. Compared to some other parts of the world. I know there are definitely at universities in Australia, there are professors and advocates of it, in Victoria and South Australia, I see. So it seems like that Europe are kind of taking the charge with this.
Yes, exactly. I would say from the academic community, Europe has a focus on this, and this has to do with the theoretical background, where it's coming from. The concept is very much related in the strategy practice literature or strategy practice perspective, as this is one perspective in strategy literature that really focuses on the practices and actors, so the individuals involved in the strategy process, and the actions that those individuals are taking in order to realize strategy. And here we have a lot of European scholars focusing on this perspective. And that's, of course, very closely related to the idea of openness, understanding the practices that are part, understanding the roles of the different individuals that are changing through this openness, different roles of leaders, but also of the people involved. So this is very closely related, and that's why we see this focus. But I have to add, a lot of people also from Australian and New Zealand universities are focusing on this. So we see a lot of traction and movement, and also have collaborations with people from there. So there is a lot of things are going on also in terms of scientific research in this area.
Brilliant, brilliant. I like how you touched on there, the focusing on the individuals and the roles drive a lot of this. So appreciate that. Now, Stefan, in terms of, there's a question here. I think it's from Maina. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies. But I've heard you talk a bit about this in the past. How do we keep the efficiency and effectiveness of strategy making, considering we're enlarging the amount of external stakeholders involved, especially in the context of uncertainty, where the frequency of strategizing exercise is expected to increase? Now, I've heard you with some really interesting stats around this. Yeah, can you talk us through what you're seeing?
Of course, I like the question of Maina. So the quickest way doing strategy is if the CEO or the owner is telling you we are going in this direction. Yeah, no discussion. This is the direction. I'm here, the founder, the owner, and I'm the boss of all this here. So we will do it like this. So you are running very fast in one direction, but maybe you are running in the wrong direction and it makes no sense. So this is the most efficient way, but efficiency here is for me a threat. So if we are looking on the old approach and the open approach, of course, we are generating what we call complexity at the start of the process, because certainly lots of people are involved. Everybody of them has his own understandings. All of them has his own ideas about the future. Yes, this makes the process, first point of view, very slow. But if you compare the total cycle from starting the strategy process until the results that you maybe jump into a new market or you scale your business, the total cycle, and there is some empirical evidence, it will shorten by 30 up to 50%. And the reason behind is this: in the old world, we have this, we call it schisma, the two worlds, the strategy formulation, then you have the implementation gap, and then you need all the efforts. Yeah, then anything what you have written in your plan will be executed in the team. And this no longer exists, because if you take all the employees, if you take experts, if you take all those who might be impacted by the strategy in the process, the barriers of implementation will be not as high as they had been before. So yes, there is complexity. Yes, at the beginning of the process, it takes all the hairs out of your head. That's and the best examples, and the CEOs are complaining, oh, Stefan, what are we doing here? I have that much emails. I cannot manage the process. Say, hey, keep cool, guy. We would like to have a brilliant strategy, and this is the price you have to pay. We need this additional complexity because, and this is also written in the question, today's world is not easy. We have here some political parties. We say, oh, it's so easy. We have the simple ideas how we can manage this country. No. This is nonsense. We have a complex world and we need the same complexity in our strategies. And this open strategy is the best way of generating positive complexity in the process. And at the end, we will get the reward that the total cycle is even shorter than having a strategy maybe in 2 weeks and then struggling by implementation. And at the end of the day, you have nothing. This is what I can say to the question of money.
Brilliant, thank you. Those stats reducing by 30 up to 50% from strategy through to execution, and they are pretty powerful figures. And because you've seen that evolution of those 10 years, I know there's literally tens, hundreds of those cycles you've seen through measurement. So I think that's really powerful coming from a practitioner as well. Graham, this is kind of a question without notice, but I think it kind of fits in with some of the questions as well. It's about it from a leadership culture perspective. And I've heard you talk about it. Leadership CEOs right down can start by saying, we don't know. And it's a pretty powerful statement. I've heard you talk a bit about it before, because a lot of leaders perhaps feel hesitant to say that to their teams for a number of different reasons. Can you just share a bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, I was interested in Stefan's example before with the roof tiles. A group of managers headed by, sounded like the owner-manager of the business. He owned the business, and is that be right, Stefan, I guess? And then you had a group of people around them. And then they became sort of self-reinforcing group that, we've got to know the answers here, guys and gals. It's dangerous. And I think hubris, which is overconfidence, is a big problem, and just got to be careful of that. I think humility is one of the keystones of a good leader. And humility would then say, well, listen, actually, we may not have all the answers here. Let's be humble and just keep an open mind, because as soon as we think we have all the answers, we probably don't, and we're probably in a lot of trouble. So if you start from that, you start from a point of strength, not a point of weakness. And I've mentioned this in that article I referred to before, that a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to look weak if I then ask people, you know, what do you think we should do? In effect, what do you think we should do? But actually, it's a point of strength, because what you're saying is we're confident enough to put our cards on the table and say, we don't have all the answers here. And people around them go, wow, this is so refreshing. This is fantastic. I think this would be a great idea. But you've got to start with inviting people to participate. Can't just say, well, we didn't really know all the answers, but if you want to contribute, go right ahead. You know that the difference. But yeah, I do think, I think saying we don't know and be prepared to say we don't know, and look around the table of executives and say, we don't have all the answers, so let's be frank about it. But that requires a very strong CEO and a gutsy CEO and a confident CEO.
Great context. Thank you. Now, just time, there's a couple more questions to get through in terms of time. In terms of Sam writes asking, you know, are the big consulting firms adopting open strategy approaches? And Stefan, I might come to you with this. Past experience is Sam is saying they don't. They work exclusively with a few exec and certain SMEs.
So I have to apologize because I'm not Julia, and I think it's better if Julia answers the questions, but I try my best. So serious again. So what I can see, the big fours, although BCG and McKinsey, they're looking at the approach. That's for sure. And to copy or to maybe create some formats and some tools, this is not a big hurdle. So this is for me a threat if I look at these questions from a smaller consultancies. The only thing which helps us to be in the market and may be a hurdle for the others to jump in is what we call the IMP experts community. So if you start a strategy process, you need these external experts, guys with a technology background, guys with a market background. We have a huge community of entrepreneurs and startups who also will jump in. And we have also what we call the lateral thinkers guy. Is usually former CTOs. They are very good in bringing in some expertise from one in a total different field. This is the only thing why the big ones currently are not able to deliver the same thing than the smaller ones, because this takes some time, yeah, just to build such a community, have the right spirit in community. Formerly, I worked with one for the big consultancies and partners, and we have also some, we call it senior advisors, but this is not the same story. We are not looking for senior advisors which jump in because they are in between two assignments or engagements. No, we have different clusters of expertise, yeah, technology-wise. We have all the game-changing technologies, yeah, teams behind this with experts. This is the only thing why the big ones currently are not jumping into approach, at least from my point of view. Otherwise, they could copy it, but they fear a bit the complexity in steering, and controlling such a huge community of external expertise, because it's not so easy sometimes. It takes a lot of time to convince them to jump in, and then have they really on board. This is the pure value of an open approach, that you combine the internal expertise with the external expertise. This is how open strategy will work, and this is, for me, a kind of a hurdle that we will not get copied and kicked out of the market. Great,
thank you. I'm going to move straight on. There's a couple of, I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but Josh, a question from Josh here. Where a business embraces an open approach to strategy with key groups of internal and external stakeholders, yet their operational culture and processes are the opposite. That's just a short snippet. But is there any comment around that, Julia?
Yes, Andrew, if I can take this question, because I think it relates a lot to what Graham already mentioned earlier, which is closely linked to the leaders, the CEOs who are in charge. and their personality and how open they are really, and how comfortable they are in terms of following this approach with a full heart, I would say. Because we have researched a lot what makes organizations ready, or what makes them capable of opening up their strategy process. What are the requirements that really need to be there to make it work? And we have found this systematically across many examples, many different types of organizations. And we just see that the leader, or the CEO, I would say the leader is the one who is really influencing how well it works. Because then this relates to all the points that have been mentioned. Do we have enough resources? Do we have an organizational structure that supports this openness also in other fields? Do people really feel that their contributions are valued? Are the contributions and the ideas and suggestions from the different people are really built on, or do they disappear in the drawer again? And those are all things that could raise a lot of frustration among the people, and that in the end really diminish the benefits of openness. So you can never fully leverage the potential of openness if you don't have a leader who really commits himself, herself to this open approach. And this is very closely linked to the personality that they have. And currently we have a huge research project where we are collecting data on the personality of CEOs and link them to the openness that they have in the strategy process, because we just see that this is such a key influence and variable. So if from the top people do not feel they get the support, then it doesn't work out, because you don't have all the prerequisites that you need to have to make it work on the longer term.
Brilliant, thank you. I think it's essence of time. I think it's a good place to end. We haven't got to everyone's question, and I will come back to people individually after the session with answers. But Sam Wright mentions to your answer there, Julia. Participative and open strategy can be a positive change catalyst for culture change for the better, and a powerful tool for a CEO board. And I think that blends into you need the top of the organization, as both Graham and Stefan have said, to lead this as well, as opposed to more of a tokenistic measure. So we're just going to finish up in terms of resources. You would have most likely seen, you can probably see the book behind me there in the background. The Open Strategy book. I would encourage to go and have a look at the book, have a good read of it. There's all sorts of different concepts that we've talked about today on the panel in there, and specific case studies and tool sets you can use. And we'll be sending out after the session a number of the key articles that Julia, Graham and Stefan have written, both in Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan. So we'll be sending out a number of links for that. And in terms of, just to wrap up, I think it's we appreciate all the questions the audience have put through. Those ones that we didn't get to, I'll come back individually and answer those through the panel. So I would urge you to have a good look at the resources we send out. We are going to be running more of a deep dive session for people who attended today, to look at how this can apply specifically to your own leadership and to your own organizational strategy. So there'll be more detail about that coming out. So again, just to wrap up, thank you all our panelists, Julia, Stefan and Graham. It's been a wonderful conversation and a good nuanced approach from all of you. So different approach.
Pleasure.
Yeah, no.
Thank you for getting up early in the morning, and thank you all for dialing in different time zones. Take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Julia.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Stefan. Bye. Bye.